names. I just want to point out before I introduce our featured speaker that Taneya mentioned our next meeting will be the first Saturday in November, and that will be a hybrid meeting so that we will be in our location at the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and the meeting will also be accessible via Zoom. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this meeting. But for now, I'm so excited to bring back to our audience this morning, Dr. Angela Sutton. I know many of you know her name and know her face because she's been before us on at least a couple of occasions. By the way, she's also a member and she's also attends several of our meetings. She came to us when we were meeting at Fort Negley. Our topic today is Fort Negley, all things Fort Negley. And Dr. Sutton came to us when we were holding our meetings there to tell us about a project that she was starting. At that time, she was a postdoctoral student at Vanderbilt University, and she had this digital humanities project that she was starting called the Fort Negley Descendants Project, which was basically aimed at finding the names of the builders and defenders of Fort Negley. As many of you know, many of them were escaped slaves, runaway slaves, and or free Blacks who came to find freedom at the Union Fort, Fort Negley. So Angela's been searching for the names of those builders through the records, the military records, Civil War military records, and you know, one of the advantages of that is those of us who research our genealogy to ancestors may find an ancestor who was among those builders. Okay, 1 second here. My screen is okay. Okay. She is now, Dr. Angela Sutton is now the research assistant professor of communications studies and assistant dean of the graduate education and strategic initiatives for the College of Arts and Sciences at Vanderbilt University. She has received 2 prestigious grants, both of them nearly $100,000, a $99,000 grant from the Digital Humanities Advancement Grant, that was from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as a $99,000 grant from the National Park Service. Funding for these grants will support the creation of a database of more than 16,000 enslaved and free Black laborers and soldiers who built and defended Nashville's fortifications during the Civil War. I don't want to hold her from giving us more information about this, but I do want to point out she's going to be talking about more than just Fort Negley. There were actually 5 forts, Dr. Sutton, that Union forts, 5 Union forts that were built in and around Nashville during the Civil War, Battle of Nashville. Nashville, as I understand, was the stronghold of the Union in the South. So all these forts were built in our city. And Fort Negley is the only one that remains. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay. All right. So without further ado, Dr. Angela Sutton is here to present her newest and latest research.
Thank you. And thank you all for allowing me to come here and share, because as I was saying earlier, there's nothing nicer than being able to talk about the thing that you're most interested in with people who actually want to hear you. It doesn't happen that often. So I'm just really grateful to be able to be here. And I wanted to quickly introduce, I have 2 people that I brought in with me. They work on my team, Jessica Fletcher and Jim Schindling. So Jessica Fletcher is my research assistant. And later on, we're going to have her show you some of the things that we've been doing on our prototypes. We're going to create a website with this database, and she's going to take us through a couple of searches to kind of show how it works. And then Jim Schindling, who is our developer, he really is the mastermind behind us being able to do this as quickly as we've been able to. Like he built Spatial Historian, which is a software that allowed us to consolidate a lot of names and almost double the names of laborers. Then that was more than Oh, not languaging today, which allowed us to almost double the amount of laborers that we know about who worked on all of the fortifications in Nashville. So without their work, it really wouldn't be possible. So I wanted to bring them here and have them show you what they've been up to as well, but just really briefly. All right, so I will begin here. If it will let me move, but maybe it won't. Okay, oh no, go back, please. It's always this way, isn't it? Okay, yes, all right, so I'm just going to do a really brief history because I think most of you know the history of Fort Negley, which is that right, during the Civil War, when the Union soldiers were coming in and occupying strategic points in the South, they picked Nashville because Nashville is a really interesting state, right? Like half of the free people were with the Union and the other half were not, and it kind of flip-flopped several times. And it was really important strategically because it's like right there in the middle between the North and the South. And because it's close to many different rivers as well. So it allows people of the Union to really strategically place a fortified city right in the middle of where they need to be. And it's like a great railroad hub as well, which is why we played such a huge role in the Civil War. And in order to do that, much manpower was needed to build all those fortifications. So we have Fort Negley, which is like the crown jewel, right? And it remains because it was just too big to destroy, quite frankly, which we're really grateful for. But then, of course, they first started with the Capitol building. That was the first one. They fortified that. And then from there, they worked outward to kind of like create this system of defenses around the Capitol to keep Nashville safe. And in order to do that, they needed people to work. And so they started raiding nearby plantations and other places. And at first they asked enslavers if they could like loan out the people that they had enslaved. And some of the enslavers were on the side of the Union and they loaned out their enslaved people to the Union in order to do this work. But then a lot of people were not. A lot of people took the enslaved people that they had and they left Nashville to keep them from the Union. So there were a lot of like different valences that happened here that I think a lot of people don't talk about and don't know about. And so toward the end, though, the Union military were getting very desperate. And so they started raiding all the plantations in Middle Tennessee. And then they started pulling both free and enslaved Black people out of their churches and things, which is what the image that you see here in front of you at the top, in order to have enough people to build all these fortifications. And initially we were told and we thought that there were about 2,800 people who had built all these fortifications. But there were many different lists, and all the different lists had not been organized or checked against each other because they're too big, right? If you have several lists that each have thousands of names and there's many overlaps, it's really tough to do that manually. So it just had never been done. So there was one master list, and the way that it was written, it was assumed that that was the collation of all the lists, and that turned out to be false. So anyway, so once Fort Negley was built, it became a place where a lot of USCT were stationed. And then after the war as well, like once the Union won, and we were one nation again, right? Once the Union won, then during Reconstruction, several of the USCT were also stationed there to occupy during Reconstruction. I know this, the first time I found out about this was from a descendant whose ancestor had been stationed there during Reconstruction, Gary Burke, which I'm sure you all know him. He is probably Nashville's most famous Civil War descendant. And so he was the one who kind of shared that with me and told me where to go digging for documents. And I wanted to share that because that's going to be a common theme that comes up with everything that I do, right? Like I'm the face of this project, but the only reason this project is able to happen is because so many people in Nashville cared enough to safeguard this stuff, cared enough to know where to find this stuff, cared enough to write it down, and cared enough to share it. And so I feel like I've just really been educated and led by the city of Nashville as I've been doing this work. People have brought their research to me and have showed me where I need to go and where I'm going wrong with it. So I just deeply appreciate that and want to give a shout out to especially Gary, because he was the first and he's been the most constant voice to pull me back on the path and be like, no, Dr. Sutton, you need to look at this. And I just like so deeply have appreciated that guidance. All right, so after that, we know that sorry, not after that. We know that in 2017, there was a huge problem because the mayor at the time sold off part of Fort Negley for condos. And a lot of us became incredibly upset. And at that time, I had just graduated and I was working at the Digital Humanities lab at Nashville in Vanderbilt, sorry. And I went down to one of the town meetings to talk about this because I was really mad and I wanted to know what I could do. And when I was there, that's when I ran into several descendants who wanted to be heard. And we talked about it, and Gary was among those people, of course. And we talked about what it meant for the city to forget what Fort Negley is and to just give it away, like what it is that we're missing out on. And so together we kind of brainstormed a way that we could help the city to see that it isn't a place, it is a representation of the city's ancestors. And like, how could you do that? Like, how could you? And so Gary found several other descendants, and we sat down and we filmed for hours and hours and edited the footage and put it together into several little documentary films. So we have the oral histories of several descendants of this population, both the builders, people who built Fort Negley and the surrounding forts, and the defenders, so Black soldiers who were part of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, who defended these forts in the Battle of Nashville. And we showed these videos in several screenings. We got a lot of press. And I like to think that was part of what helped to fight this development, right? Like everyone's got to do their part, but it was really the whole city coming together in a riot saying, no, you cannot sell our heritage like this. And so then I realized just how important this space was, but how little people knew about it. So we worked with the Nashville NAACP and the Friends of Fort Negley to nominate this fort on the UNESCO site of enslaved persons, the slave route, it used to be called. And this route is, it's a site, it's like the idea is that Fort Negley is so important that it deserves to be known by the whole world as an example of how people of the African diaspora were able to survive enslavement, resist enslavement, break free from enslavement, and then continue resisting the dehumanization that came afterward, right? So like it encompasses so much. And the reason why it's so important is because it isn't just a site of slavery, right? Like America loves to have their plantations. They love to show the plantations as like the premier Black history sites. And plantations are not the Black history sites, they're white history. They're the history of the enslavers. That's what you learn from a plantation. But what you learn from a place where people fought for their freedom and where people later, as we'll talk about, settled at the foot of the space to create one of the first free Black neighborhoods in Nashville, what you learn is that this is really the genesis of America's history when we finally come together as a country where we realize that slavery is an evil that needs to be overcome, where we realize that we need to work toward equity and equality. Still not there yet, but it is the genesis of where that process began. And that's why it's so important when you look at it in the context of global history. And then when you shrink it down, it's really important for our city because, well, as you'll see from the work, 18,500 people are in this database. And if you think about 18,500 people minus the people who died, so a few thousand there, then you think about the 7 generations it's been since the Civil War. Think about how many descendants that is that live here in Middle Tennessee that have a connection to the space and whose history was suppressed, whose ancestral records were not put out, whose ancestors' names didn't make it into any history books. Like that to me is a great injustice. And so I wanted to help work on this a little bit. So after the Descendants, during the Descendants Project, I got to meet Taneya Koonce because, again, y'all used to have your meetings at the Fort Negley Visitor Center, and I'm there all the time. Like I pretty much live at Fort Negley. So I met with Taneya and we kind of talked about this, and she volunteered to do a video with us to show people how they can figure out if they are also a descendant of Fort Negley, like if they belong to this population. And we had a lot of fun with this video. It was really wonderful to be able to film and to kind of work with her. This other person in the video, Destiny Hanks, she used to be my research assistant. And it turns out that she is also a descendant of Fort Negley. She's a local from here in Nashville. And she was able to trace her history using the process in the video to find her ancestor in the records as well, which was really special. And this happens a lot too, like people who are drawn to the space. Maybe they don't know for sure that they have a connection, but generally they will find out later that they do. And so Destiny she was just a Vanderbilt undergrad, just wanting some extra money. And so we were working together, and through the process, she discovered that she is in the records too. Like her family is part of this history. And so after we filmed this video, I was talking with Taneya and I was like, you know, what, like I guess in the video, she shares a lot about how documents are generated and how a lot of descendants of this space and a lot of African Americans in general, like they really struggle with finding documents during that time of emancipation and enslavement, because once you hit that certain brick wall, right, there's no way to search for your ancestor unless you know who enslaved them. And that is such a big jump because all of those things, it's not like the enslavers are super proud of it. It's not like they put it out there. So it's a little bit difficult to find. And so we were kind of brainstorming, like, how would you, like, if you had the time, and, Taneya worked with databases, so she knows all about how they work and how to put them together. She's like, if you had the time, how would you create this database? And I'm just like taking furious notes, like, and what else would you do? And where else would you look? And she was really instrumental in like kind of helping me to realize that it's a possible thing to do. Like, it's a project that is doable if you just have a little bit of time and money. And I'm really fortunate to be allowed to work at a place that's over-resourced. And so I was like, I will find those resources and I'll make it happen. This is a project that I feel matters. And when you work on a project that matters, the drawbacks, they don't sting as much, right? So she's the one who got me really excited about creating a database. And I was already at the Digital Humanities Center anyway. So I was like, let me start a working group. Let's get other people involved and let's see what we can do. All right. So started looking into the primary sources, and that was a daunting task, because when you start to try to figure out what is the paper trail, right? Like, how do you know where everybody is? Like, how were people kept track of? If you're looking at enslaved people who were pulled from plantations by Union soldiers, and then you're looking at free Black people who came voluntarily to give their labor in exchange for payment, right? They're looking for a job. Then you're looking at self-emancipating people who ran away from further away and came to Nashville as a way to hide behind Union lines, to hide from their former enslavers, to not be enslaved again. That's a daunting task. Like, where do all those documents come from? Like, how do you know, right? So we kind of started like thinking about document generation, and that's like the biggest thing when you're a historian. Like, if you know how a society kept records and how a society preserved those records, then you can find out the information you're looking for. And so fortunately, again, like Taneya knew a lot, but also there's so many public historians here who work with Fort Negley, who work with the Nashville City Cemetery Association, who work with Tennessee Central Railroad, who work just in the most surprising places, right? There are people who have been stewarding this history and who've been safeguarding it and who've been consulting these records and who know. Chuck Sherrill also at the TSLA. So we have many partners who we consulted to ask, I wrote up a plan and I presented it to them and I was like, is this doable? Like, are these all the records we need? What else do we need to do? Where else would you look? And with that, we kind of came up with the list of all the things that needed to be done. And while I was asking around, Nashville did this wonderful thing that Nashville always does, which is they start gossiping, right? We're still a small town, like we're growing, but we're a small town. And so they started gossiping like, hey, there's this lady at Vanderbilt who's been asking a lot of questions, which is wonderful, because then that meant that a lot of people came to me and were like, hey, I already did this. I already did some of this. And so we had Fletch Koch, for example, from this cemetery association. Several years ago, she had already gone through some of the records that we needed, and she had already written down all the important things and put them into a database form, an Excel sheet. And so we were like, oh, thank God, because instead of having to go through every single microfilm and write down everything ourselves, we just took her thing, went to the microfilm and just checked it to make sure it was right. And it was right, because of course she knows what she's doing, right? Like, everyone in Nashville knows what they're doing. And so we were able to collect things that other people had done. Krista Castillo at the Visitor Center, she already did a big clip of this herself, because she's been wanting to create something like this for a long time, because that would help with the interpretation of Fort Negley, to be able to have the names and the information, the biographical information, the relationships, all that information like about the people who built it and the people who were stationed here. And so a lot of people had already done the work, and a lot of them brought others to me who had already done the work. And so I ended up sitting on top of just a bunch of stacks of other people's work going, okay, now what? So now my work changed. I thought I was going to go into the archives and just sit there and transcribe for years, right? Now my work changed from going to the archive and transcribing to checking everyone else's transcriptions and putting them into a format where they are all in the same format, so that a machine can read them and so that a machine can start sorting them out. And so I was like, okay, that's a slightly different job. Let me figure out how to do that. So I took a couple of data science classes and I sat in on some of the working groups at Vanderbilt and kind of learned how to do it. And then I got to work with Jim Schindling, who's our developer. I already knew him because I used to work with the Slave Society's digital archive. So archival work is already sort of familiar to me, but this is database work, not archival work. It's a little different. Anyway, so all that to say, we were able to distill thousands of records down into just the biographical information about the enslaved. And that's really important, because we wanted to center the enslaved people. They never got to be centered in any of their historical documents, right? Like when you look through all the historical documents of this population, it's all about what people of African descent can do for white Tennesseans. So it's all like, you are an object, you are a laborer, you are a soldier, you are a thing that is useful for us. And that is incredibly offensive, and just, I didn't want to reproduce that, right? It's really important to not reproduce something if it's wrong. And so I looked through and wanted to center every person that we found who had been enslaved or formerly enslaved, and figure out a way to make them the star of the archives, so that they're the names that we're searching for, and all of their connections are the ones that we're writing down. All of their biographical information, any little slip of anything that was about them, we tracked and we wrote down. So most of the things that we have are relationships, which is great because we can build out family trees. We can build out who knew who was married to who had children with who, and those kinds of things are really difficult to do with enslaved people in general. So it's really nice to be able to have some of those things, and to be able to like make it a person-centered database. Let's see. Yeah. And I guess I also just want to say like thank you to everybody. Like I feel so humbled by how much work has already been done and how freely people were sharing it with me. It really was the case of like people being excited that I was doing this and giving it. And in academia, that often isn't the case. People tend to guard their work a little more closely, and they're like, well, I did this and I had to go through it, so you need to. And that was not at all the experience I had in the city. I felt just really humbled at everybody tripping over themselves to hand me their research, and allowing me to use it in the database. So it's this is a really special kind of project. I think that comes from the city of Nashville, because so many people in Nashville cared enough to make this happen. All right. After that, I found out that since 2017, there had been archaeologists from MTSU who had been doing digs on the other side of Fort Negley, over where the Science Center is. And I was just beside myself. So I went to go check it out and introduce myself to the archaeologists. And I was like, what are y'all doing here? What's down here? And it turns out that right after the war, and this makes total sense. It's just not something that this process wasn't written down anywhere that people regularly research. So a lot of us didn't know, but a lot of Black people knew, which is often the case when it comes to Black history. Black people are the preservers of it, of course. So you have to listen, otherwise you're not going to get it. So basically what happened was, after the war, many of the soldiers and the laborers who survived, they had nowhere to go back to, because where are you going to go back to, right? Like, and so they chose to stay in the city of Nashville. And that's where a lot of our historically Black neighborhoods come from. And Bass Street was so interesting because it's right at the bottom of that hill, right? So if you can imagine like where the Adventure Science Center is, like you just look up and like Fort Negley is like right at the top, overlooking that, right? And so they settled right where the Adventure Science Center is in that strip, and all the way through up until the city. So that was the Bass Street neighborhood. And for a long time, people had thought that it was destroyed, because it was flattened for urban renewal. So the city decided that it needed to renew itself. And so they flattened a Black neighborhood, because that is what they've done as well in North Nashville and Jefferson Street. They flattened the neighborhood to put a highway in, to put 65 in, and also to put in the Children's Museum, which became the Science Center, right? And so after they flattened it, they just said that like, no, everything's been destroyed. There's no point in doing anything there. And so everyone just believed the city. But then MTSU came in, so Zeta Law and Andrew Wyatt came in to take a look, just to see if that's true. And it was not true. It was not true. It was not true. They flattened it, yes. But in flattening it, they basically just pushed everything over and packed dirt on top of it, which preserved it, which is so the opposite of destroying something. I mean, yes, it's a destruction, but in terms of what remains, right, in terms of what you can learn from that space, that's the very best possible way to destroy something if you have to destroy it, because now we have all of this evidence of what people in Bass Street lived. And it's so important because these are the descendants of the veterans, the Black veterans of the Civil War, and one of our first Black neighborhoods, along with Edge Hill and Cameron Trimble, right, in that area. So it's incredibly important that we kind of figure out what was going on here, because also in those first years of Reconstruction, right, people who were formerly enslaved were just learning how to read and write. They were sending their kids to school for the first time. They were involved in the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, trying to figure out their finances. And then after Reconstruction abruptly came to its end without actually reconstructing anything, people in this neighborhood had to reconstruct themselves. And so when you think about like, how did we get to this point? Like looking at a place like this is so incredibly important. All right. And so we realized very quickly that we needed to bring descendants into the space because there are people alive who lived at Bass Street, and we wanted to be respectful about it, right? Like it's disrespectful to just pick through people's things and then make up stories about them. If they exist, they should also be part of this process. And so I called up Miss Janine Blackman. She is the CEO of African American Cultural Alliance, and she's also a descendant of the Bass Street community. Her aunt and her grandmother both lived there, and they were both forced to leave when the highway came through. And her aunt owned a beauty shop as well. And so we got to talking. We brought in the pastor of the Bass Street Church. So this church has had continuous attendance since the Reconstruction era. It's just moved a couple of times. Now it's up Brick Church Pike, I think. And so we brought in the pastor because we wanted to have that continuity, and we wanted his approval. Also, I really wanted the Bass Street Church members to see what was happening there and to see that we were trying our best to preserve something that really matters and to help the city better understand itself. It's really important to us. So we brought people in, we read the names of the people who had lived on Bass Street, and then we collected a lot of the artifacts. And you can see in the bottom corner there, those are the photographs of some of the artifacts that were found at Bass Street. My favorite one that's really interesting to a lot of people is in the top right corner, there's a whole bottle. And that is, maybe you can see it on there, Lydia Pinkham's medicine. Lydia Pinkham, she lived next door to the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and she created PMS medication. And then she would pack it into a big bag, and she would come down and hand sell to populations. And a lot of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and their descendants really trusted her medications. And you can see that because so many of them are found often in African-American communities, which is really interesting. So it's things like that you just wouldn't know if you didn't have the opportunity to look and to ask. So what you can see in the top picture is Miss Janine. She's pouring libations, but next to her is pastor of the Bass Street Church, Dale Thompson. Next to him is Mr. Minter, and next to him is Mr. Scruggs. Mr. Minter and Mr. Scruggs were children who lived in that community and who were forced to leave during the urban renewal period. And they were able to tell us things that archaeologists were like really stumped by, or things that we couldn't have known just from looking at the material culture. And so we collected their oral histories, and we want to move forward and find more people to talk to so that we can figure out what happened, like between the Civil War and this legal freedom happening. How long did it take for people to actually free themselves, right? Like there's this process of freedom. People think like, oh, emancipation, we're done. It's not the case, right? There was emancipation legally, but then there was still formerly enslaved people who had to fight for their dignity, fight for their rights, fight for their ability to be seen as free Americans. And that took a very, very long time. I would say it still is taking a long time in many ways because this country does not want to move on fast enough, right? All right, so then, but let's get down to the database and numbers. The reason why I brought up the archaeology is because I wanted to show how this is, it's really so close. Like I think a lot of people think like Civil War was a long time ago. Well, a lot of people think Civil War was a long time ago. A lot of other people also know that it wasn't that long ago and that we're still living in the shadow of the Civil War, and all of the consequences of the Civil War of Reconstruction are still with us today, right? Like all of the failed Reconstruction, we can see that today in all the inequities that we see here, and especially in the South, but in the whole country as well. So when you look at Bass Street community, it's so close. Like we still have descendants who lived there. It's your descendants of the veterans who defended the city during the war. The numbers, the reason why the numbers are so different. And sorry, this is the only really boring slide. Just sometimes you just have to have all the words. I try not to have slides with too many words because it's a lot. But so this first one in red here, the list of laborers employed August 1st through April 1st on the fortifications and their owners, documents of Lieutenant George Burroughs. This was what we used to think of as the master list. So it was assumed from the way George Burroughs wrote about it, that he had taken all of the lists of all of the people who had supervised the enslaved and free builders of Nashville's fortifications and collated them into one book. And he sort of did that, but he didn't get all of them. And not only did he not get all of them, but then later other lists were created by other white officers of the Union who were keeping their own lists for their own record keeping, because all these forts were being built sort of around the same time. And people who were laboring on the forts were moved between different forts, which is why when people ask, like, do you have a list of people who only worked at Fort Negley? No, because most of the people who worked at Fort Negley also worked at Fort Gillem, which is now where Fisk University's Jubilee Hall stands. So like we know that people were moved around and were kind of forced to labor on many of the different forts. And some of them were also forced to work on the railroads because the Union needed to lay more track because they needed to move a lot of soldiers and a lot of provisions around. And then after the war, a lot of dead bodies got moved via rail. Anyways, so this first list had about 2,800 people on it, and that was the number of laborers that we assumed existed. And we knew these other lists existed, but there's so much overlap. Like if you look at the second one, that second list, a lot of that first page, a lot of the names on that first page exist on the first list. And each of these lists have thousands of names on them. And without a computer to do this work for you, it's almost impossible to like see, right? And it's all in handwriting. It's all in that really small like handwriting. It's all in microfilm. And so manually, it's not a job that's doable, which is why we're so insanely lucky to have a developer working with us, Jim Schindling, who wrote a program that's able to, once we clean up everything, so we picked all of the names and all the information from each of these lists and put it into spreadsheets. And we had help, right? Like Fletch Koch and Natalie Goodwin helped us. And Krista Castillo did some of this work too. So like we didn't have to do it all on our own. And then once all of these things were compiled, we cleaned them up to make sure in the spreadsheet, they all looked the same. So each list looked different because each Union officer kept records differently because they didn't have standardized forms of record keeping back then. So like each one just kind of like kept their own haphazard lists, and each one had categories that meant something different. So it was very frustrating. So we had to like change all of that to make all of them the same. Once they were all the same, we were able to feed each list into Spatial Historian, and Spatial Historian was able to tabulate all the identical names, knock them out. If we know for sure they're the same person, we knock them out. With some people, we don't know if they're the same person or not because they appear on multiple lists. And they could be the same person, but it could also be the same name. Like many fathers and sons, of course, have the same names, right? So it's hard to know sometimes if it's the same person or not. Sometimes the dates will tell you because there's no way someone could have worked at Fort Negley and Fort Gillem at the exact same time. Like that's not possible. So we know those are two separate people. Sometimes we have the birth date of someone. And if we have two birthdays that are different, we know they're two different people. But again, like every list was different and every list had different information on it. So we don't always know, which means that after we were able to knock out everyone we know for sure are the same, we had to keep in about almost 500 names that could be duplicates or could be different people. And there's just no way to tell without further information. So we've done the best we could with what we had, which unfortunately is just always what happens with the further back you go in history. But so once we processed all of these, now the number of laborers that we have is 4,933, and that's the big end of the number. And the reason why we give that number is because to my mind, it's better to overestimate by a few hundred than to erase even one person who was actually there. And the reason for that is because, you know, many of these names, like that first list, the 2,700, they've been tweeted out by Fort Negley Park. They've been used in people's research. Those names are slowly becoming part of the historical record again. And that's been really wonderful to see because they've been working on this for, I think about 7 or 8 years. And so being able to slowly see those names trickling out has been really nice. But the other half of those names, they've never ever, in my lifetime, in anyone's lifetime currently alive, they've never been out there. They've never been used in history. They've never been said. They've never been tweeted. These are almost 3,000 people who never got their due, who never got to be named as our city's ancestors, our city's heroes, the people who protected us from the insurrection, right? The people who ensured that we could be one country. And it's just like, it's so infuriating to think about the fact that we just had our city's ancestors sitting there and nobody had done the work to properly honor them and to properly say their names and to properly add them to the historic record to show what they have done for us, right? Fort Negley Park's Twitter account is amazing because they are tweeting out every single name. I gave them all the names and they took it upon themselves to tweet out every single name. Everyone gets their own tweet, and that tweet is like, it goes out to the internet, it's out in the world. And I just think that's incredibly wonderful. I think they do about 10 tweets a day. And they did this back when they started working on the initial labor roles. So they tweeted those out already. Now they're adding the extras that we found. And I think that's incredibly special just to have those names. And every time they come across my timeline, I always because it's so important that people can see just how many people's families were involved in this history. And especially when you look at like the disparity, right? Because most white people involved in the Civil War, they know everything. All of their information is out there. It's all been digitized. It's so easy to find. It's so easy to pull together your family tree if you're white. If you have Black ancestors, though, it's really difficult. And a lot of that stuff just never makes it out onto the internet. You'd have to go to TSLA. You'd have to pull up the microfilms. You'd have to manually search through all the microfilms until you find the name that you want. And that's just a deep disparity and injustice that hopefully this database can help correct a little bit. It'll at least make it easier for people to find everybody. So here are the numbers. The initial labor rolls had about 2,800 people on them. The total is more like 5,000 now, right? So 4,993 if you want to be exact. Plus, we've added in some additional numbers. Those additional numbers come from the list of railroad workers that we know were working on the Northwestern Railroad. We know that they were working for the Union. We know the Union specifically pulled people out of plantations and forced them to work on these railroads. We also have some other sources that talk about people who have worked as enslaved people for the Union. So, for example, do y'all know Miss Ophelia Egypt? She, after the war, she went to interview people who had been enslaved, and then she wrote the book. She was working for Fisk as a professor, and that book is still at Fisk University. It's in their special collections. So through that and found all the people who had some involvement with the Union in some way, who'd been working with them, and also entered them in the database because we didn't want them to be forgotten. Because sometimes they just don't make it into records in other ways, right? You have to find as many different ways as you can. Plus, we added in all the USCT soldiers who fought at the Battle of Nashville. That was 8 different regiments. And then we also added in the small number of enslavers and white officers who were listed alongside the people in our database. And we chose to do this because when you are pulling together family records or relational data, often these people did become the family of the enslaved, right? And in one way or another. And so it's really important that they are also shared alongside. And so the total number then comes to 18,500 people, and the vast majority of them formerly enslaved. All right. So right before I finish, I just wanted to bring this up because for those of you who don't know, Dr. Taneya Glimpf, she is a rock star. She's a Duke. She's poised to become the next president of the American Historical Association. And she works on mainly, she works on so many things. She's an expert on Reconstruction, which is the period of history that people know the least about because we want to forget it the most. And she works on especially enslaved women and children, and then their kind of trajectory to freedom and what that looks like. And she is coming here physically, like her whole person is coming here next weekend on Saturday. She's going to come to Fort Negley and she's going to speak about her research as it pertains to Nashville, especially like during that difficult transition between enslavement and freedom. And I am just like so beside myself to welcome her because it's, she's I can't even tell you how big she is for this field. And so she's someone who I think a lot of professors anyway will be bringing their books for her to sign. And I would like you all to be able to come if you want to make it. If not, we're going to try to find a way to stream it. She's given us permission to live stream, but not to record, which means that if you look at Fort Negley's social media this next week, they'll announce where you can catch that, probably on Facebook Live or Instagram Live, I think. So we're going to do that. I think Jessica's going to be taking care of that. So you'll be able to watch from home too if you can't physically be there. But I would encourage you to go because she will say the things that other people don't have the courage to say. And she just changed my whole understanding of US history. Like one talk and I was like, oh, okay, I need to drastically reorient myself and think about how to think about the world. So she's one of those people. So I would not miss her. If you have the opportunity to see her now. All right. So now I'm going to move it over to Jessica. She's my research assistant, and I want her to show you some of the cool things that we can do with the database. Jim is also here in case anyone has like database heavy questions. I don't know how many like computer scientists or data people we have here, but sometimes there are questions that I just can't answer because I just work with the history. I don't always know. So it's a treat to be able to have them both here too, because we are working on the website that will go along with the database. We're at the stage now where all of the names are in the database. Most of the information is in there, not all of it, but we're getting there. We're still adding a couple of things. For example, the penitentiary records, something I also didn't know. Chuck Sherrill pointed this out to me. He said that during the war, a lot of the Black soldiers who were deemed as non-compliant ended up being put in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. So there's a really interesting kind of relationship between the national apparatus and the state apparatus, and how the state of Tennessee supported that and was happily taking Black soldiers as prisoners. And then the numbers of incarcerated inmates jump up sky high after the Civil War, and those are due to Black inmates being admitted, which is part of course, the whole the state's desire and need to control Black people now that enslavement is no longer an option, right? So those numbers are incredibly important. When we started running the data that Chuck had collected from the penitentiaries, we saw a lot of overlap between what he had found and the laborers who built the forts and the soldiers who defended them as well. So those are being added too, and that will, I don't think it'll make the number go up too high, because really it is this population that ends up incarcerated, which is incredibly important. And we're writing an article about that now, about what that means, and kind of linking it to broader conversations about the carceral state and Black people in the prison system, and how kind of like how that shakes out over time, like, because this is where it started after the Civil War. So it really, it's a long trajectory of this, like this prison pipeline. All right, not to leave it on too heavy of a note there, but let's move over to Jessica. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Jessica, you should be able to share your screen if you're still here. And I would like you just to kind of like show them the website that you and Jim have been building. Well, Jim has been building it, but me and Jessica have been like helping him with how to, you know, how it should look, all the non-difficult things. And I'm so thrilled with the idea of this, but there's a lot that is not yet finished. There's a lot we need to work on. We want to tweak a lot of the wording. We want to, you know, every now and then we do searches on the database to see what it shoots out, and what it shoots out is confusing. So we're like, oh, we made a mistake somewhere. So we're still kind of fixing it, but this is the prototype. It is not yet public, but we really wanted to show it to you because well, selfishly, I really care what you think about it. So I'd really like to hear your opinions, and I'd just like to hear your kind of initial reactions to this. Like, would you use this? If you were using this, what else would you like to see here? All right, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Angela. And I just want to say thank you so much again for everyone joining us today to learn more about this project. And we are so excited to share it with you and get all of this information out there. So I'm sharing my screen right now. Can everyone see the website prototype right now? Okay, great.
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So like Angela mentioned, Jim and I have been working, we've all been working really hard on putting together a prototype for the Builders and Defenders database. And I just wanted to walk you through some of the early pages that we have here. For example, this is what we put together for the homepage that really introduces everyone to the project. What the project is, what it's focused on, and what people will be able to do with it. We also really wanted to feature some different collections that we've been working on, primary sources, and some of the really big takeaways from the project. So for example, you can see here, we're talking about that really big impact that Angela spoke about the really big change in numbers from the laborers, and showing the sources and talking about it. We also just discussed some various points about wartime Nashville, different sources too, like the Nashville Northwestern Railroad, and just how important the Battle of Nashville was, and the USCT soldiers too. We also want to showcase, of course, Fort Negley in the news and in the media, and how people can learn more. And really important is linking this to the descendant stories as well, and just like really pulling together the present day connections that this database has to the descendant community, and the stories that we're able to build from it. So of course we have Dr. Eleanor Fleming here, Gary Berg, the Johnson family, and how—
I think I saw Carmen Johnson in here as well, so I wanted to shout out to her.
Yeah, Carmen was on.
Your family.
Oh, wonderful, awesome. Well, we're so happy to be able to showcase everyone here, and how these connections can really build from this database as well. So this is kind of, like Angela said, this early prototype where we want to really showcase different parts of the project. We're going to be working on talking about the history of it, publications, events, people connected to the project. We're also going to be going into a lot of detail about the sources. So for example, I'll just go to a couple pages here where we really go into detail about what the sources were that we worked with, how we processed the sources, how we imported them into the database and did data cleaning and standardization, just so everyone can follow along with how we worked with the data. And so now to show you probably the most exciting and important part of the database. And again, like Angela said, this is so much thanks to Jim and spatial historian and the software development, is how we can search for people in the database. So right now, everything is linked here and we're able to search it. And I'm going to do just a couple of example searches just to show you the various connections that we're able to see here. And then also the different types of layers and levels to the database that you're able to interact with through the searches. So for example, I went ahead and searched in Ruffin Bright, who Dr. Eleanor Fleming is a descendant from. And whenever I type in his name, his information comes up and we're able to see some basic biographical information and some notes that we were able to pull from the sources. We're also to see relationships that were put from the sources. And if we go here to the references, this shows where all of the primary sources where Ruffin Bright appeared. So we can see, like Angela was saying, that really that all of the many different labor roles and how many people overlapped on them. We see that he was also one of the people that overlapped. So his name showed up on the original Fort Negley labor rolls and also on 2 labor indexes. And what we're also doing whenever we have images for these sources, we're also connecting the images to the sources. So for example, if you are searching for someone's name and go to their references here and click on this button, you'll be able to see the actual image of the source, and you'll be able to look through it, find their name, and be able to do further research. So if we look in, I'm not sure if I'm able to zoom in, but if we look here, we can see Ruffin Bright's name right here and find additional information too. And we can do that with the labor indexes as well. Ruffin Bright appears there as well, along with, as Angela said, thousands and thousands of other names too. So we're working on adding those images. We won't be able to have images for all of the primary sources, but for the labor roles we will, and for a lot of the labor correspondence from about the laborers, we will have those images too, as well as the Nashville Northwestern Railroad and some additional ones too. So another really interesting search that I wanted to put in, and I think I saw this on one of the primary sources on a slide that Angela showed, was Martha Jackson. I think hers is really interesting. We are able to see some really interesting family relationships through her connection. She showed up in a set of correspondence papers that we've been working with from union officers that have correspondence about laborers and their family members petitioning for payment for the labor that they did on Fort Negley. So she is making a payment claim as the widow of Willis Jackson for his work on Nashville's fortifications. And whenever we click on relationships, we can see that Martha Jackson has a relationship with Willis Jackson, and their relationship is defined here as spouses. So we're able to see these family relationships come to light. There are a lot of additional relationships too from these petitions, these payment petitions, spouses, parents, children, and it's a really, really great network to be able to pull together. We will be able to have images for these, but they're not on there just yet. And we're also tracking events too. So for example, we have a monetary claim for an event that she is involved in, but then we'll also have the Battle of Nashville, for example, for events, the construction of Fort Negley as well. So a lot of different ways to link people together. And then another one that I wanted to show you was Jerry Waters. So this is another really interesting example of overlapping names. Jerry Waters' name appears on two different groups of documents. It appears on the labor rolls, which I believe is it's this one here. So Jerry Waters' name appears on 3 different labor rolls, but it also appears on the USCT spreadsheet. So we did not merge his name because, you know, there's no way that we can be absolutely certain that they are the same person. But we see these 2 names as being a part of the construction of Fort Negley, and then also serving in the USCT. So further research can, you know, see if there are any connections and ties, and to trace those names across those different groups. And I guess, like, just for one last example, is Elizabeth McGavick Carter. Just to really showcase again the amount of relationships that we can see through the database. She has many different connections here. Many of her children are listed, her spouse, enslavers are mentioned, and her parent as well. And her information is coming from the Belle Meade slave listing, and just being able to connect these family networks and connections, I think is going to be a really big tool from the database, and being able to see these networks come together. So yeah, we're so excited to share this, and to have it searchable, and to learn more, and everything. So if there's anything else that you'd like me to show, Angela, or anything, just let me know.
No, that's wonderful. But if anyone here has any questions or any comments or any thoughts about how we've constructed the database, how it looks to be working right now, or just ideas that you have for things that you would like to see, or things that you've thought of that we haven't, I would really love to hear them. And if you don't want to say them here, please, you can also get that to me, like, via email. I'm totally happy to take emails, or to on social media, you can tweet at me, or I'm on Instagram now too, because all the young people are doing that, I guess. No, the young people are doing TikTok. I'm not brave enough to venture there yet. But yeah, we would love to hear this. Oh yeah, Mill Perkins asks, when will this be available to the public? So this is the prototype still. In spring, we are planning to have a session with you all, hopefully, and Taneya and Natalie, where we sit down and work the website that we think is finished. And I want y'all to find all the mistakes that we made. No, I want y'all to use it and see what the user experience is. So essentially, play around with it, type in the names that you know, type in some of the last names that you know, and see what comes up. And if there's anything confusing about how the database is working with you, or if there's something that doesn't make sense, or if your results, you know that they're wrong, I want to hear about it. So that would be amazing. And then once that's done, we'll clean it all up, and hopefully the summer of 2023, this will be ready to go, and it's going to be free and open to the public. We think it's really important that things are not hidden behind paywalls, especially when a lot of the money, as Natalie mentioned earlier, the money came from public grants, right? This is the government funding that gave me the money to do this. And no, I don't get to keep the money. The money goes toward hiring people like Jessica and Jim so that I can get help. But because it's public money, because your taxes paid for this, you should be able to access it for free. And also, we took all the data that we got and we shared it with Enslaved, which is a bigger process called Enslaved People of the Atlantic Slave Trade. They are trying to create a gazetteer of everyone's research in the whole world that deals with slavery and enslavement. And we've added all of our things there just in case something happens to me, something happens to Vanderbilt, something happens to the website. The data is going to always be available online for everybody, because I just feel so strongly that people deserve to have this data.
That's excellent. I'm so glad to hear that y'all have contributed it to Enslaved. That was going to be one of my questions. Have you thought about archiving the data set? So that's perfect. Connie has a great comment for y'all. She says, looks very user-friendly. Love the primary sources, images that are linked to the names. She sees herself using it with students in order to learn more about Fort Negley. So
that's another thing. We're going to have a tab. I think we already have a tab that says for teachers. So, and I know that Connie has already created a wonderful, just a absolutely wonderful lesson plan about Bass Street that we've already shared with teachers that are working in Davidson County and in Williamson County as well. So that lesson plan is available for people to learn about Reconstruction in the Bass Street community. And her presentation was just like A+, right? So we want to add everyone else's things too. So if you're a teacher, if you know a teacher, if you're using this in any way to educate educate young people, I want to see your lesson plans and I want to share those. I want this to also be a place where teachers can come and get ideas for how to use this database, because this is Nashville history. This isn't only Black history, this is all of our history. And I want all of us to have to use this and to have to think about it and to learn from all of these things that the city has sort of forgotten about.
Brenda has her hand up. Brenda, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Yes, I have a question. I see where you can search a specific name, and you also talked about you were tweeting out the list of the people that you know of that work there. Is there any way you can just have a list that you could just go and look? Because my family settled in that area, but I never have heard any stories about anybody working at the being part of the board. You know, you may just want to take a look at last names and see if any names ring a bell. So is there any way to do that? Will there be a way to do that?
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Jim helped us create that. So the idea is that now you should be able to, once it's done, not now, but once the website is ready, every one of those sources you should be able to click, and our database, the one that we created in Excel, should be available for download. So you can just take it with you and have it. Like, none of the data is proprietary or anything. Like, it's share and share alike. We took it from Nashville, so we're giving it back to Nashville.
All right. Tamara has a question. Somewhere down the road, would this be available at the visitor center where someone can look up a name?
I think it would be really, really great if you emailed people at parks and asked that question. Because I would love that. Yes, they would absolutely have all permissions to use it. This is something that I don't want permissions to be a barrier for anybody anywhere. So we will try to raise some funds so we can get a kiosk for people to be able to do that. They already have access to the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors System database, which comes from the National Park Service. And that one will help you look up if you have a USCT connection, but it doesn't have any of the laborers in it. So I would like for this to be something also that there's a kiosk there and people can do that research at the visitor center, because then you'd have people like Tracy and Krista who can help.
Yeah. I have a
I like
question.
that question.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ring in that I like that question
yeah.
about making some of this information available on site. Because of course, when people think of Fort Negley, they want to go to Fort Negley, and there's a visitor center there. Can you go there and do some of this research? I think that's very important. I really like the idea of including K through 12 classes and resources. The lesson plan, how can you get that? Because I know some teachers, and I know that that's something that could definitely interest a lot of teachers.
Yeah, so here I can share the screen again really fast. Oh, maybe I can't. Okay. Here we are. Yeah. Oh. Okay. No. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So. Oh, it's not here yet. Okay. There will be right up here in this bar. There's going to be another little bar right here that is for teachers, and that's where we're going to share, because the Fort Negley Descendants Project already has that. Here we are. Yeah, so the Fort Negley Descendants Project is also going to have one right here. Right now it's just the tour, but we'll update it with lesson plan materials as well. But if anyone needs them right now, just email me. I can share with you what we have. It's not a lot so far. So far, it's a traveling trunk for K through 8 about the USCT, and Mr. Gary Burke is in there, which is very cool. And then the other one is the one that Connie Fink designed around the Bass Street community, and that one is appropriate for middle school, early high school. But I'm hoping that there'll be more teachers who'll be willing to share what they've done in the classroom. I work with the Williamson County Educator Institute. It's a yearly institute that they have with their public school teachers to kind of talk about the challenges in teaching history right now, which, there's a lot of complaining, but also a lot of ways of being creative about how can you take curriculum, there are things that kids have to learn, but the way that they learn them is up to the teachers. This can be the material that they use to teach these core skills in history and in geography and in all different types of in demography. You can even teach databases with this, right? So it doesn't have to be that you're teaching a controversial whatever class. You can be teaching something that has nothing to do with race at all, and this is just the material that you're using to bring it into the classroom to make sure that more students get to see everybody represented in the core material.
Right. Thank you. Ernestine has a question. Is there a cemetery connected with Fort Negley?
Kinda. Yeah. Actually, I think Zeta Law would probably be the best person to speak about that. I don't know if I don't want to put you on the spot, Zeta, if you're not able to talk about that right now. But if you are, do you want to say a couple of words about that? And she may not. She may be like listening in the car or something.
Right. Let's see
Which
if
is
she
fine.
comes.
But basically, like, you may want to ask her later too. I know she pops in here a lot too, into these meetings. But basically, there is the city cemetery, which is like just right next to Fort Negley. We're hoping with this new master plan that we're about to talk about that there will be an ability to purchase that strip of land that sits between the cemetery and Fort Negley, and then create like a walkway or a bridge to connect the two, because we know that basically, after people died, it was so complicated, but after the Battle of Nashville, many of the bodies were transported to Fort Negley for further transport, because Fort Negley was right next to that railroad, right? We got that railroad running right between the city cemetery and Fort Negley. And so a lot of the bodies were there. We know that a lot of people claimed the bodies. And so the bodies that were claimed were put onto the railroad and sent away to their families. A lot of people were not claimed. And so they were buried in a big pit at Fort Negley. And then later on, when they built the National Cemetery for veterans, they unearthed a lot of them and put them into the cemetery together, but they didn't get everybody. Some people are still left at Fort Negley, which is why there's been all this controversy, right, about the bodies and about people not respecting the fact that Fort Negley itself is essentially, it could be a cemetery. Like it isn't a cemetery, but perhaps it should be, right? And then also the city cemetery has some of the people connected to Fort Negley also buried in it. So there's a lot to be done yet. There's a lot of work to be done to kind of identify where all those missing people are. But one thing that is really fascinating about this as well is that everybody was buried together in that pit. I mean, everybody, Black, white, Confederate, Union, everybody dead, buried together. Right after the war, we were all one, metaphorically. I think it's very powerful to kind of think about that, and to also treat fairly the people who were left behind in that pit.
Dr. Sutton, you just said several things that started questions in my mind. So the pit you're talking about, is that where Greer Stadium is?
Kinda. Yeah, it's sort of in that area, but more toward the back and toward the railway line as well. I know that we're also looking into acquiring, not we, the Friends of Fort Negley, I'm on the board there. We're looking into acquiring that space for the city, so it will become part of Fort Negley Park so that all of it can just be safe. And we're currently looking to work with people who would help us fund that so we can do that.
Right.
Connie just shared it in the chat.
I know lots of people have questions. I will, one of the things I'm going to talk about later when we talk about the master plan is the body that was recently discovered, or there were two bodies. It was in the national news. We'll talk about that later, but go ahead and finish, Dr. Sutton. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I just wanted to pay attention to the chat. It's been moving really fast, so thank you so much. But Connie is sharing her lesson plans and her slides, which please look at those, because I'm just in awe. Like it's a beautiful program. She did such a great job of like making it multimodal for every type of learner, by involving many different senses, by involving many different skills. So it is a really killer lesson plan. And it's something that I haven't seen something of that caliber in a long time, which is really beautiful to see that. I just feel like it really honors this population to be so careful and so thoughtful with the way the history is presented. Another thing I wanted to say too, like that kind of connects to the master plan as well, is that I have a personal feeling and wish that all 4,993 names of the laborers be inscribed somewhere on the park. I know that with the master plan, we're creating a lot of different spaces for guests to come and interact with the park. We're creating a lot of room for people to be able to kind of read about the park. There's going to be a memorial there as well to the laborers and to the soldiers. And I think that when you go to similar places like the Whitney Plantation and other places where large numbers of African Americans suffered, died, worked incredibly hard, and gave a lot for this country, you have these names inscribed. And I think that I don't want to aggrandize myself, but I do think we need to aggrandize these laborers, because their names have not entered the historic record. They deserve to be carved on that space, to know that like they're the reason why we get to enjoy being a country, a whole country, right? Like they're the reason they did this. They sacrificed not only for themselves, but for the whole country. And that's something that we all as a country together need to respect and honor. So it's something that I would urge you, if you feel the same way, to be vocal about that with parks, be vocal about that at the mayor's office, be vocal about that at any meetings that we have with the Parks Board, with the city council. Let your city councilors know that that's something you want to see as well. That I think that would go a long way toward helping people to really understand the grand kind of the big scale of the sacrifice that happened here in Nashville that nobody ever talks about.
Right. Alan asked if all the laborer names in the database are associated with Fort Negley only, or are they also connected with the construction of other fortifications?
Yeah, it's for all of the forts. It's almost impossible for us to know exactly who worked on which fort because of the way the records were kept. We know a lot of people worked on multiple forts at the same time or were moved around between all the forts. So when I say the laborers, I mean the laborers of every fortification in Nashville. So it encompasses everybody, but Fort Negley is the focal point because it's the only one that survives and is allowed for us to kind of have this memorial space.
Right. Tamara's wondering about the names of the other forts besides
yeah.
Negley and Gillum.
Yeah, so Fort Gillum was over where Fisk University is now. Jubilee Hall sits right on top of it. And if you go to the Fort Negley Descendants Project, you can see Carmen Johnson talking about that history because her ancestor, he was actually enslaved over by in the Belmead area. And I think, yeah, from the Harding family. And then he ran away to help the Union effort. First, he helped to fortify the Capitol building itself with Andrew Johnson, who would later become president, right? So he worked with Andrew Johnson to fortify the Union Capitol. And then he was caught by his enslavers and he ran away a second time. And then he ran to Fort Negley and he was asked to help build Fort Negley. And then after the war, he went over to Fort Gillum, helped deconstruct it and build Jubilee Hall on top of it. So her ancestor pretty much helped build the entire city. It's an incredible story. So if you go on the Fort Negley Descendants Project, you can hear her and her siblings talk about that. And then the other forts were Fort Harker, Fort Sam Houston, and then I'm trying to remember. Oh, and the Fort Sam Houston was where, do y'all know E.S. Rose Park over in the Edge Hill neighborhood? That's where that was. So it's a park now, but they removed all the fortifications. But basically everywhere where there is a historic Black neighborhood, that's where it happened. That's where the forts were. That's where a Union presence was, like a hospital or some garrison or something, because generally that was the safest place for Black people to be during this like really volatile time. And that's sort of how you can see the geography of Nashville is shaped by the way the Civil War kind of happened and by what the Union soldiers did. Thanks for sharing that.
Right. And she also wanted to know, you mentioned that there were people pulled from church to work. When did that happen?
I'm not sure. The only place where I've seen that occur is in that picture, and that picture comes from the Annals of the Cumberland. And they don't mention which church and they don't mention exactly where, because again, it's that wasn't the focus of what they were writing about. So it's very difficult to tell. And we don't know if the engraving, we don't even know like what church it comes from necessarily. But I think I think this is one of those things that just like kind of like enters the historic record because it's one of the only things we can kind of latch onto that existed at the time.
Right. And Linda's asking, do you know the names of persons conscripted from First Color Baptist Church? No.
I wish I did.
No. I have a question. You're consistent with the philosophy of getting, the community to engage and contribute and be part of the stories told. How do you envision that working with the new database? Like what ways are y'all thinking about of allowing people to contribute what they may know?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. Jim is actually the one who's been spearheading all of that. I was very narrow-minded. Well, not narrow-minded, just I had my vision on like, we have to finish the database. We said we were going to finish it. We have to finish it. So I'm so grateful that I have Jim and Jessica who kind of pull me aside and are like, hey, we also got to do this. So Jim has been thinking about ways that we can help to contribute. Jim, are you able to talk about some of the possibilities? Are you here still?
Yep, still here. Yeah, how's everybody doing? Yeah, it's really, I think really the issue is you want to vet some of the contributions. So we can certainly set up a site, let people contribute. And then that would go through an approval, essentially a research approval process, but that could certainly be added to the website to be able to do that. So
yeah,
so like you're talking about like crowdsourcing things, right? Like the ability to kind of like have people just donate whatever information they can find that they haven't found on our website yet.
Right. And that,
and even things like the question about people who are from the First Colored Baptist Church. One of the things that we didn't really demo is we have things called entities. So that could be a church, a school, a military unit, whatever. And we have connections to those things. So we would be able to add people and connect them to these different entities as well. So, and that is, I guess the big advantage there is that gives you some implicit connections between people then. So your relatives who were connected to this institution maybe have some affiliation with other folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have the ability, if we want to add it, to help people build out family trees on the site. But I think it's only something if that's wanted. I know that there are other places where people are building their family trees and people might not want that information public, or they might not want anyone else to see it while they're kind of constructing that. But we do have options as well. And Jim has been so wonderful because he always keeps up with all the latest database trends, and he's been scouring genealogy websites to kind of see what else other people are doing.
So here's a suggestion. Even if you don't build it onto the site, providing an easy way for people to grab a citation or a source would be helpful, because when we do put it in our family tree files, we'll know exactly how to cite and refer back to our source, which is the database, the Widows and Defenders database. So that's exciting.
Very cool.
This is incredible work, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you giving me the ideas and all the help. I really feel like sitting in on these meetings has really helped me to kind of think through ways that Black people construct histories, and how little is available by the traditional means that we have when it comes to history. Like in the traditional discipline of history, there's just so little there to help people whose names are not where they're supposed to be, right? Whose stories were not deemed important enough to preserve. It's a whole other skill set, and y'all are miles ahead of the academy with that. So I just wanted to say, like, thank you so much for having this group, for coming together, for thinking through this, for helping each other with this work, because your work in this group is what allowed me to kind of think through how to do the same thing on a bigger scale.
On a bigger scale. Yeah, because it's, so often there's also issues of accessibility. And so the work that you're doing is really making these records more accessible in a broader sense, in a broader way, to more people in ways that we just didn't have before. So that's a really important advantage to what we're seeing with what you're doing. So
thank you.
We're excited for the release. Y'all are doing great work building the database. I mean, I'm very excited.
Thank you. Me too.
I'm sure the group is too, from the comments we've seen. And I wanted to make a note. Let's see. Oh, there was something. Oh, I wanted to make a note for everyone that Dr. Sutton shared her email address in the chat. So you can contact her if you have additional questions. And Zeta did too as well. So if you have more questions about that archaeology work, you can reach out to Zeta.
And Zeta is on the City Cemetery Association, and she's also on the technical advisory committee to Fort Negley. So she's really a great person to ask about, like, body things and archaeology things and cemetery things and how those sites are connected. I think a lot of what I know I learned from her.